everybody, and welcome to Lesson 8-1, the Cold War Roots of the Vietnam War Conflict. In our last unit, we looked at the Korean War, and that was a shorter look. But now we're going to take several lessons to dig into a longer, more lasting, more impactful war in American history, that being the Vietnam War. So let's look at how it gets started. Before World War II, Vietnam was a French colony called part of French Indochina. The French had controlled most of Southeast Asia, and there they focused on gaining wealth through exporting rice and rubber. That was what the French were interested in Southeast Asia for. The Vietnamese themselves, however, grew poorer and poorer as they were increasingly kicked off of their own land in order to make room for these large French rice and rubber plantations. One person who took issue with that is this gentleman right here, Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh fought against French rule. He did not like this European colonizing power coming in and telling them what to do and how to run their country. And he forms, together with some others, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, the ICP, in the 1930s to fight against French rule. Now, the ICP organizes French protests and initially starts with more of a peaceful focus to it, but the French are not tolerant of protests against their rule. And many of the leaders of the ICP were rounded up and were executed for their resistance to French rule. Ho Chi Minh himself, however, survived by fleeing across the border and escaping into China. Now, in World War II, the Japanese defeated the French. The Japanese come into Indochina and take over that area from the French. And Ho Chi Minh returns to Vietnam, but this time to fight against the Japanese. And the U.S. see the enemy of our enemy as potentially being our friend. If Ho Chi Minh was willing to fight against the Japanese, then the U.S. was willing to help. But after the war, once World War II is done, France wants their land back. They want to control Indochina again. And so they return with U.S. help and U.S. blessing, and they try to recolonize the nation. The war then becomes declared between France and Vietnam in 1946 as the Vietnamese freedom fighters, those who had fought against Japan, Ho Chi Minh in particular, wanted to defend their nation against being recolonized by the French. So what happens next? Well, in 1949, Chinese nationalists, non-communists, lose a civil war to Mao Zedong and the communists in China. All of a sudden, a major world nation, China, has become a communist nation. Now, the Truman Doctrine, President Truman's pledge to never allow the spread of communism, sets up a potential challenge here. But China is a big deal, and the United States does not feel prepared to apply the Truman Doctrine to China. And so we kind of make a pass on that one. We'll let China become communist because really we're powerless to stop it. But the spread of communism to Vietnam, well, that's something the U.S. feels that we could take a hand in stopping. So we do fight against the spread of communism in Indochina, which means we will be siding with the French in this French-Vietnamese conflict. This all ties into a theory that was passed around in the 1950s called the Domino Theory. If one nation were to become communist, soon it would knock over other nations in the region, and soon we would all be communist. So in the 1950, the United States sends money to help the French. In 1953, we continue that aid and expand it under President Eisenhower. And their fear ties into this domino theory that if Vietnam fell to the communists, then the rest of Indochina would soon fall. If Indochina fell, then South Asia may fall. If South Asia may fall, all of Asia may become communist. And this is the domino theory. So the plan then comes into play after a 1954 uprising by the Vietnamese, where the Vietnamese overrun a French fort at Dien Bien Phu. After this uprising, after this attack and massacre of French soldiers, the French decide they're out. They're done. We don't need Indochina. It's not worth our time. We've been fighting here since 46. We can't reestablish our plantations. It's just too costly. We're done. We're out. But the U.S., we've already committed. We've already said this domino thing is a real thing. So if the French are going to leave, fine, but we still can't let them be communist. So we come up with this plan. All right, what we'll do is we'll divide the nation into two parts, North and South. The North can be communist. The South will not. And after 2 years, in 1956, we'll have elections. And the people can decide which nation, which government do they like better. And they can have whichever one they want. And we in America believe, of course, they're going to choose the non-communist government. How could they choose communism? Ho Chi Minh winds up in control of the North. Gets chosen, elected to form a communist government in the North. In the South, we have Ngo Dinh Diem. He is pretty quickly becomes a dictator, simply ruling through military force. And you can see Diem right here with President Eisenhower. He was our guy. He was our pick. And he was our pick largely because of his anti-communist stance. But he becomes extremely unpopular by being very vicious in his persecution of communists. And when things get further along, in 1956, the election to reunite the country is creeping up. Diem realizes he's going to lose this election. And so he simply refuses to hold them. There will be no elections. The South Vietnamese do not get to pick their leader. Their leader is Diem. And Vietnam will not be reunited. Well, some people in the South don't like that very much. Diem is now a complete dictator. The elections are not going to be held. And a communist resistance arises in the South. And it gains support by the public, who look increasingly at Diem as what he is, a dictator. This resistance takes the name the National Liberation Front. But it simply becomes known for its short name, the Viet Cong, which is short for Vietnamese communists. And the Viet Cong will fight against Diem and his government. In addition to the Viet Cong, the North will step in this fight to overthrow Diem. The North supports the idea of reuniting the nation. And so North Vietnam is going to support the Viet Cong by sending supplies through Cambodia and Laos, neighboring nations, along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This path becomes problematic later in the war for the United States. But we can see that North and South Vietnam are just a very thin line. It's a long coastal nation. In order to supply the whole nation, the North Vietnamese simply send the supplies through Laos and through parts of Cambodia into the nation. And that's how they work around that particular problem. So we have the North supplying the Viet Cong. And John F. Kennedy, President of the United States, now is put into a difficult position. 1963, it looks like Diem and the South Vietnamese government is going to collapse unless the United States gives more active support. So in 1963, the United States does just that. 13,000 U.S. troops are sent to Vietnam to help Diem. But this was not the only thing that Kennedy had to focus on during the Vietnam War. He was facing challenges from communists throughout the world. And there was this worry, this concern that maybe Kennedy was weak on communism and that he could be tested. And indeed he was. In 1961, the Soviet Union threatened to close access to West Berlin, this little island of capitalism in the middle of communist East Germany. The East Germans were going to the city to flee communism. More and more East Germans wanted to get out of East German communism, which wasn't going well. They were going to West Berlin. To stop their people from leaving, the Soviets built a wall, the Berlin Wall, this structure right here, that completely encircles the city of West Berlin. A second challenge is also the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1961, again, Kennedy attempted to overthrow a communist leader in Cuba named Fidel Castro, this man right here. He does this through the Bay of Pigs invasion, where the small force was supposed to lead a popular revolt against communism. It fails. The Soviet Union then gets emboldened and places nuclear missiles on Cuba, nuclear missiles capable of striking the United States, a huge escalation of the war. Now, the USSR, the Soviet Union, does eventually remove those missiles when the U.S. In turn promises that they will never invade Cuba. Cuba can remain communist. We won't apply the Truman Doctrine to Cuba. So while Kennedy is dealing with all of this, he also has to deal with Vietnam. U.S. aid to South Vietnam is increasing, but Diem is not this popular guy. We are increasingly, and the world knows, supporting a violent, ruthless, unpopular dictator, all in the name of democracy. He needed to go. The South Vietnamese leader needed to be removed, or the war was lost. You can't fight a war for democracy by supporting a man like Diem. The South Vietnamese military says that they have a solution. They say, let us take care of it. This is an internal Vietnamese problem. We will simply remove Diem. And they go to the United States and they ask for permission. Can we get rid of him? We'll lead it. The military itself, we can take over the nation. We don't need Diem anymore. Kennedy agrees to this. He says, yes, you can go ahead and do that. But don't hurt Diem. Arrest him if you need to. Keep him locked up. But don't hurt him, or this will be seen as simply a military takeover. Well, on November 1st, 1963, the military takes over and Diem is assassinated. They do not follow this advice. And so the military government in South Vietnam will not have any more credibility than Diem had in the first place. And it will get worse. I hope you enjoyed this lesson today. We'll certainly dig deeper into Vietnam in the next one. Farewell.